Michelle Harris has been on countless undercover missions, but this one feels different. Sent to a small town to investigate a financial scandal at a beloved community center, she must hide her true identity as an FBI agent and pose as a choir director. But as she navigates small-town politics and unspoken racial biases, she realizes that the divisions she uncovers run deeper than missing money, and solving the case might tear the community apart. With children's futures at stake, how far will Michelle go to expose the truth without destroying everything? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Michelle Harris stepped out of her car and into the cold, brisk air of the small town that would be her home for the next few months. She took in the sight of the community center, a modest, weathered building that had served as the heart of this town for years. To her, it was just another assignment, another layer of deception she had to adopt. The community didn't know that she was an FBI agent sent to investigate suspected financial irregularities within the center. Instead, they would come to know her as the new choir director, a role she hadn't filled in years. The building itself was unremarkable, a faded brick structure with large windows and a humble sign out front. Children and adults alike bustled in and out, giving the place a sense of liveliness that belied the dark cloud hanging over it. Somewhere within these walls, someone was diverting money meant for programs that kept this place alive. Michelle's job was to find out who. She adjusted her scarf and stepped inside, immediately greeted by the sound of laughter and conversation. It felt warm, welcoming even, but Michelle had been in this line of work long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving. She approached the front desk where a receptionist was typing away on a computer. "Hi, I'm Michelle Harris, the new choir director." The receptionist barely looked up. "Mr. Fisher's office is down the hall, third door on the right." Michelle nodded and made her way through the halls, her senses on high alert. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her as she walked past, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. It wasn't uncommon for her to get this kind of reception, but she'd hoped for a little more warmth. She had grown accustomed to being the outsider, but each time, it still stung. When she reached Mr. Fisher's office, the door was already slightly ajar. She knocked lightly and pushed it open to find a stout man in his 60s sitting behind a cluttered desk, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He glanced up at her, eyes narrow. "Ah, the new choir director," he said without much enthusiasm. "Come in." Michelle entered, taking in the cramped office filled with paperwork, old photographs, and a faint smell of coffee. Mr. Fisher gestured to a chair in front of his desk, and she sat down. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Harris," he began, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I didn't want to bring in an outsider for this position, but the last director, well, let's just say things didn't work out, and now we're in a bind, so here you are." Michelle kept her face neutral. She knew her cover story well, an experienced choir director looking for a change of pace, eager to help small communities thrive. In reality, she had been chosen for this job not because of her experience with music, but because she had a knack for uncovering secrets. "I understand," she said. "I just want to do what's best for the kids." Mr. Fisher eyed her for a moment, then nodded. "Well, choir practice starts tomorrow. I'll introduce you to the staff and students. Just don't expect everyone to warm up to you right away." His words were almost a warning, and Michelle got the distinct impression that he wasn't just talking about her role as the choir director. There was something unspoken, a tension that hung in the air. She filed that away for later. After a few more minutes of logistical talk, Michelle left the office, feeling the weight of her assignment settling on her shoulders. She had to not only teach these kids, but also navigate the complicated social dynamics of this town, all while investigating a financial scheme that could destroy the very foundation of the community center. As she made her way back down the hall, she nearly collided with a tall man carrying a stack of papers. He stopped abruptly, eyes narrowing as he took her in. "Choir director, right?" he asked, his tone neither friendly nor hostile, just cautious. "That's right," Michelle replied, extending a hand. "Michelle Harris. Jonathan Pearson," he said, shaking her hand briefly before pulling back. "I work with the youth programs here. Been doing it for years." Michelle could feel his eyes appraising her, searching for any sign of weakness or inexperience. "Well, I'm looking forward to working with you," she said, maintaining a pleasant tone. Jonathan didn't return the sentiment. "We'll see how it goes," he muttered before walking past her, leaving Michelle with the distinct feeling that her presence was not entirely welcome. That night, Michelle sat in her temporary apartment, reviewing files on the community center's finances. Everything seemed to be in order on the surface, but she knew better than to trust the surface. The missing funds were subtle, carefully concealed in line items that seemed innocuous at first glance. Whoever was behind this knew how to cover their tracks. Her thoughts drifted back to Jonathan. He was one of the senior staff members, deeply entrenched in the community. His attitude toward her had been cold, dismissive even, and she couldn't help but wonder if it was just because she was an outsider or if there was something more to it. Could he be involved in the financial scheme, or was he simply wary of change? She closed the file, leaning back in her chair. Tomorrow would be her first day working directly with the children and the staff. She had to play the part of the dedicated choir director while also keeping her eyes and ears open for any sign of the corruption she was sent here to expose. As she stared out the window into the dark night, Michelle knew that this assignment was going to test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about navigating the unspoken tensions, the prejudices that simmered beneath the surface. And if she wasn't careful, those tensions could unravel everything. Jonathan's words echoed in Michelle's mind long after he walked away. She finished gathering her music sheets, her thoughts swirling around his comment. "They've been through a lot." He had said it with a tremor in his voice, as if the weight of it pressed on his chest. There was no doubt in her mind now. His resistance wasn't about her. It was about something bigger, something tied to his role in the community and what the choir represented. As Michelle left the choir room, she found herself wondering about the children's lives. Many of them came from difficult backgrounds. She could tell just by observing their interactions. A few of them were quiet and reserved, others more boisterous. But there was an underlying sense of fragility in the room, as if they were clinging to this choir as their safe space, their escape. It reminded her of her own childhood in a way. Walking down the hall, she made her way toward the director's office. She needed to meet with Mr. Fisher to review more of the financial documents, but before she could turn the corner, she heard voices, muffled but intense, coming from one of the rooms nearby. It was the unmistakable tone of a heated discussion. Curiosity got the better of her. She slowed her pace, careful to stay out of sight as she approached the room. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack she could make out two figures, Mr. Fisher and Jonathan. Their voices were low, but the tension was palpable. "This is getting out of hand, Jonathan," Mr. Fisher said in a harsh whisper. "We can't keep covering this up forever. Sooner or later, someone's gonna notice." Jonathan's response was quieter, but Michelle could hear the frustration in his tone. "We're not covering anything up, Fisher. We're trying to keep this place afloat. You know as well as I do that without those funds, half the programs here would be shut down." Michelle's pulse quickened. She couldn't hear everything, but what she did hear was enough to confirm her suspicions. There was something going on with the center's finances, and Jonathan was involved, whether directly or indirectly. The words "covering this up" rang in her ears, amplifying her unease. "I'm telling you, this new choir director's trouble," Mr. Fisher continued. "She's asking questions. What if she digs too deep?" Michelle felt her breath catch in her throat. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding. They were talking about her. Mr. Fisher's words, though cautious, carried a thinly veiled threat. She had known from the beginning that this assignment would be delicate, but now she realized just how precarious her position was. She had to be careful. Too many eyes were already on her, and if she pushed too hard or asked too many questions, she might tip her hand. And yet, the more she learned, the more certain she became that her investigation was hitting closer to the truth. That afternoon, as the children filed back into the choir room for their second practice of the week, Michelle's mind was still on the conversation she had overheard. She tried to push it aside, reminding herself to stay focused on the task at hand. The children needed her, and for now, that had to be her priority. But Jonathan's presence at the back of the room didn't help. His watchful eyes followed her every move, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing her, waiting for her to slip up. Every time she gave a direction or corrected a student, she could feel his gaze like a weight on her shoulders. Still, Michelle pushed through, keeping her energy high and her tone encouraging as she guided the kids through their vocal exercises. She knew that winning the children's trust would be the key to blending into this community. If she could show them that she genuinely cared about their success, maybe she could lower some of the defenses that had been put up against her. As the practice session wore on, one of the younger boys, Ethan, caught her attention. He was small for his age, no more than 10, with a shy demeanor that made him stand out in the lively group. Michelle had noticed during the last rehearsal that he barely sang above a whisper, and today was no different. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Ethan, could you sing that line a little louder for me?" Michelle asked gently, kneeling down beside him so she was at his level. Ethan's eyes widened, and he looked down at his feet, shaking his head. "It's okay," Michelle said softly. "You've got a great voice, I can tell. Just give it a try." Ethan hesitated, glancing around at the other kids who were now watching him. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and Michelle could sense the tension building. She didn't want to push too hard, but she also knew this was an important moment for Ethan. If he could just find the courage to sing, it might open up a whole new world for him. Before Ethan could respond, Jonathan's voice cut through the silence. "Leave the boy alone, Michelle," Jonathan said from the back of the room, his tone more commanding than she had ever heard. "If he doesn't want to sing, don't force him." Michelle straightened, caught off guard by Jonathan's interjection. She met his gaze, but there was no hostility there. Just a firm protectiveness, as if he was standing guard over the boy. "I wasn't forcing him," Michelle said, keeping her tone calm. "I was just encouraging him." Jonathan didn't back down. Sometimes encouragement can feel like pressure. Let him sing when he's ready. For a long moment, the two of them stood in a silent standoff. Michelle could feel the eyes of the children on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She knew she couldn't push back too hard without alienating Jonathan even further, but at the same time, she couldn't let him undermine her authority in front of the kids. With a deep breath, Michelle turned back to Ethan and gave him a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Ethan. You don't have to sing if you're not ready. We'll work on it together when you feel comfortable." Ethan gave a small nod, relief washing over his face. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate as the children returned to their practice. But Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan's intervention had been about more than just Ethan. It was a subtle power play, a reminder that in this community, he was the one who knew the children best. Later that evening, as Michelle sat in her small apartment reviewing her notes from the day, she couldn't stop thinking about Jonathan. His protectiveness over the children was obvious, but it went deeper than that. There was a part of him that seemed almost defensive, as if he was guarding not just the kids, but something within himself. Michelle had seen this kind of behavior before. People who built walls around themselves, not because they were trying to keep others out, but because they were afraid of what might come to light if those walls ever came down. Jonathan was hiding something, and Michelle was determined to find out what. But as much as she wanted to dig deeper, she knew she had to be careful. The conversation she had overheard between Jonathan and Mr. Fisher still weighed heavily on her mind. There was more at stake here than just choir practice or even the community center's financial mismanagement. Something larger was at play. And if Michelle wasn't careful, she could find herself in over her head. As she lay down in bed that night, her thoughts raced with possibilities. Who was behind the missing funds? What was Jonathan's role in all of this? And why did Mr. Fisher seem so concerned about her asking too many questions? Michelle didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. The more she uncovered, the more dangerous this assignment was becoming. And as the weight of hidden biases and buried secrets pressed down on her, she realized that navigating this community would require more than just skill. It would take patience, resilience, and a deep understanding of the human heart. Tomorrow, she would go back to the choir room and face the children, Jonathan and Mr. Fisher, again. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on how far she had already come and how far she still had to go. Michelle was no stranger to difficult cases, but this one was different. This time, it wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about healing a fractured community. And that, she knew, was a task far more complex than any investigation she had ever undertaken. The next few days at the community center passed in a blur. The choir practices continued smoothly. The kids began to open up to Michelle, and she could feel the walls between her and Jonathan weakening. Yet, in the back of her mind, the conversation she had overheard between Jonathan and Mr. Fisher kept replaying, a constant reminder that things weren't as simple as they seemed. Michelle knew she had to play her cards carefully. She had to maintain her cover, befriend the staff and the children, all while subtly investigating the financial discrepancies that had led her here. It wasn't easy to balance these roles. Every interaction felt like a dance. One misstep and the entire investigation could be jeopardized. She kept an eye on Jonathan, watching for any clues that might point to his involvement in the missing funds. He was still distant, but there were moments when he softened, especially when they worked together with the choir. Michelle found herself respecting his dedication to the children, even as she remained wary of his motives. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one afternoon. Michelle was sitting in Mr. Fisher's office, pretending to review choir materials, while he busied himself with paperwork. The atmosphere in the room was casual, but Michelle knew from experience that this was the perfect time to probe. She had to ask questions without raising suspicion. "You've been with the center for a long time, right?" Michelle asked casually, flipping through a binder. 20 years, Mr. Fisher replied, not looking up from his papers. "Seen a lot of changes. Must be hard to keep everything running smoothly," Michelle said, "with funding issues and all." Mr. Fisher paused for a moment, his pen hovering over the document he was signing. Michelle watched him carefully, noting the subtle tension in his posture. "It's always a challenge," he said, his tone measured. "But we manage." Michelle nodded, playing it cool. "I noticed that the programs here are really well funded compared to other places I've worked. The kids have everything they need." Mr. Fisher glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We're fortunate in that regard. We've been able to secure some good donors over the years." "And the finances?" Michelle asked, her tone light. "It must be hard to keep track of everything with all the donations coming in." Mr. Fisher's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We have a system. I handle most of it personally. It's important to make sure the money is used wisely." Michelle met his gaze, her own smile unwavering. "Of course." She didn't push any further, knowing that pressing the issue too much could raise suspicion. But she had planted a seed of doubt. Mr. Fisher's careful phrasing and his sudden wariness confirmed what Michelle had already suspected. He was involved in the financial irregularities. The question now was, how deep did it go, and was Jonathan complicit or just caught in the middle? Later that evening, Michelle sat in her apartment, her laptop open in front of her. She had spent the last few days gathering as much information as she could, reviewing the financial records she had managed to access. It was all very subtle. Small amounts of money moved around in ways that, at first glance, seemed innocent. But Michelle knew better. She had seen these kinds of schemes before. There were discrepancies in the donations and the actual amounts being spent on the programs. It wasn't blatant, but over time, the missing money added up. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to hide their tracks, but they hadn't counted on someone like Michelle coming in to look at the numbers with fresh eyes. Her investigation had hit a critical point. She needed to confront Jonathan, but she had to be sure before making any accusations. If she was wrong, the entire case could fall apart, and worse, she could lose any chance of uncovering the truth. Michelle closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being thorough, on never jumping to conclusions. But with every new piece of evidence she uncovered, the picture became clearer. Mr. Fisher was siphoning funds, and there was no way he could be doing it alone. The next day, Michelle decided to take a risk. It was late in the afternoon when she found Jonathan in the storage room, organizing supplies for the youth programs. He looked up as she entered, surprise flashing across his face. "Need something?" he asked, his tone neutral, though Michelle could sense the guardedness beneath it. "I wanted to talk to you," she said, stepping into the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow over the shelves lined with sports equipment, art supplies, and choir materials. "About something important." Jonathan straightened, setting down the box he was holding. "What is it?" Michelle hesitated for a moment, then decided to go with her gut. She had to trust that Jonathan, despite his reservations about her, cared about the community and the kids as much as she did. "I know what's going on, Jonathan," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. "With the finances. I've been looking into it, and I know money is being diverted from the programs." Jonathan's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't say anything. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Michelle thought he might deny everything. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want any part of it," he said quietly, his voice strained. "I swear I didn't. But Fisher, he made it seem like we had no choice." Michelle's heart raced. This was it. The confirmation she needed. "What do you mean?" Jonathan shook his head, frustration etched across his features. "Fisher's been skimming money for years. He justifies it by saying the programs still run, that the kids are still getting what they need, but it's not right. He pressured me into going along with it, said if I didn't, the whole center would go under. And honestly, Michelle, I was scared. I couldn't let this place fall apart." Michelle could hear the conflict in his voice. He wasn't a bad person. He had just been caught in a web of lies, trying to protect the kids while grappling with his own sense of morality. "You should have reported him," Michelle said softly, though she understood why he hadn't. The fear of losing something so precious to the community had kept him silent. Jonathan leaned against one of the shelves, his face pale. "I know. I just didn't know how to fix it without destroying everything." There was a long silence as Michelle processed his words. She had come here looking for answers, and now that she had them, the weight of the truth settled heavily on her shoulders. Exposing Mr. Fisher would have consequences, big ones. The center could lose funding, the programs could shut down, and the kids could suffer. But how could she let the corruption continue? "I'm not here to destroy the center," Michelle said finally, her voice steady. "I'm here to help, but the only way we can do that is if we come clean. Fisher needs to be held accountable, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't harm the kids." Jonathan looked at her, a mixture of relief and fear in his eyes. "How do we do that?" Michelle paused, thinking through her options. It wasn't going to be easy, but she had a plan forming in her mind, a way to expose the truth while protecting the people who mattered most. "We work together," she said. "We confront Fisher. We find a way to fix the finances and restore the programs. But we do it quietly, without causing a public scandal. The kids don't need to be caught up in this." Jonathan nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. "I'll help, whatever it takes." Michelle smiled, feeling a weight lift off her chest. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. With Jonathan by her side, she could take on Fisher and set things right. But even as they made their plans, Michelle knew that this was just the beginning. Exposing Fisher would be dangerous. He wouldn't go down without a fight. And there were still questions that needed answers. How far did the corruption go? And who else, if anyone, was involved? The echoes of those questions would soon ripple through the entire community, and Michelle would have to navigate them with care. But for now, she had taken the first step. She had an ally, and she had the truth. And with that, she was one step closer to restoring harmony to a fractured community. The following days were a whirlwind of tense conversations and subtle maneuvers. Michelle and Jonathan worked carefully, laying the groundwork for their confrontation with Mr. Fisher. Every move had to be calculated. They needed to protect the community center, while ensuring Fisher's wrongdoing came to light without causing irreversible damage. Jonathan had been quiet in their meetings, carrying a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. He was a man deeply tied to the center, and the thought of tearing down what he had spent years building weighed on him. Michelle could sense his inner turmoil, but she also knew he had made his decision. He would see this through, no matter how difficult it became. The tension at the center was palpable. It wasn't long before whispers began to circulate among the staff and parents. Suspicion was brewing, and though no one had any concrete information, there was a sense that something was wrong. Michelle noticed the sidelong glances and quiet conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room. It wasn't just the financial investigation that was weighing on her. The town itself seemed to be on edge, and Michelle could feel the undercurrents of division that ran deeper than the center's problems. Prejudices that had always simmered beneath the surface were starting to bubble over. The community, which had once seemed tight-knit, was beginning to show cracks, and the center had become the battleground for those tensions. Michelle saw it in the interactions between the children, too. Subtle things, comments made in passing, looks exchanged between kids from different backgrounds. She had always been good at reading people, and she could see the seeds of division being sown. It broke her heart to see the kids, who had once come together through music, now beginning to drift apart. One evening, as Michelle was locking up after choir practice, she found Evelyn, Jonathan's wife, waiting for her near the front desk. Evelyn's face was etched with worry, and her usually warm demeanor seemed strained. "Michelle, do you have a moment?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent. "Of course," Michelle replied, setting down her keys and giving Evelyn her full attention. Evelyn glanced around to make sure no one was listening before speaking again. "I've heard things. People are talking. They're saying something's going on with the center's finances, and I needed to know if it's true." Michelle hesitated, torn between protecting the investigation and her growing respect for Evelyn. Jonathan had told her about his wife's openness, how she had been one of the few people in town who welcomed change. Michelle sensed that Evelyn wasn't just asking out of curiosity. She genuinely cared about the community, and about Jonathan. "I can't go into details," Michelle said carefully, "but there are things that need to be addressed. Jonathan and I are working on it." Evelyn's expression faltered. "So it is true." She paused, biting her lip as if weighing her next words. "Jonathan's been distant lately. He won't talk to me about it, but I can tell something's eating at him. I don't want to see him torn apart by this." Michelle felt a pang of guilt. Jonathan had taken on a heavy burden by joining her in this fight, and it was clearly affecting his personal life. But she also knew that confronting the truth was the only way forward. "We're going to fix this, Evelyn," Michelle said, her voice firm. "It's not going to be easy, but Jonathan's doing the right thing. He's trying to protect the center and the kids. I think, deep down, you know that." Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "I do. I just hope the community can survive whatever's coming." The next day, Michelle and Jonathan decided it was time to confront Mr. Fisher. They needed to be direct, but they also had to be careful. Fisher was a respected figure in the town, and if they weren't strategic, the fallout could be catastrophic. Jonathan's face was set in grim determination as they made their way to Fisher's office. Michelle had laid out the evidence they had gathered, just enough to make it clear that they knew what was going on without giving away their entire hand. As they entered the office, Fisher looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing at the sight of them together. His expression shifted from surprise to suspicion almost immediately. "What's this about?" Fisher asked, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Michelle glanced at Jonathan before stepping forward. "We know about the missing funds, Mr. Fisher." The room fell into a tense silence. Fisher's face remained calm, but Michelle could see the flicker of something behind his eyes, fear, perhaps, or anger. "You've been diverting money from the programs," Michelle continued, her voice steady. "We have the records to prove it." Fisher let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Is that so? And what exactly do you plan to do with that information, Miss Harris? You think you're going to take me down and save this place? You have no idea how things work here." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice filled with restrained anger. "We're not trying to destroy the center, Fisher. We're trying to save it. What you've done, it's wrong, and you know it. This community deserves better." Fisher's eyes darkened. "I did what I had to do. You think this place runs on good intentions alone? The money doesn't just appear out of nowhere. I made sure the programs continued, that the kids didn't suffer. Michelle shook her head. But they are suffering. The programs are stretched thin and the kids are starting to feel the effects. This isn't about you or your control over the center. It's about them. They deserve honesty, not lies. For a moment, Fisher said nothing, his jaw clenched as if he were calculating his next move. Then he stood up, his face contorted with a mix of frustration and defiance. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he spat. This community is already hanging by a thread. You expose this, and it'll tear the whole place apart. The programs will be shut down, the funding will dry up, and those kids you care so much about, they'll be the ones who pay the price. Jonathan's fists tightened at his sides, but Michelle placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to stay calm. She could see the desperation in Fisher's eyes, the fear that he was about to lose everything. And in that moment, she realized that Fisher wasn't just a villain in this story. He was a man who had made the wrong choices, trying to hold on to something he thought was slipping away. We're not here to destroy the center, Michelle said quietly. But this has to stop. There's still a chance to make things right. If you come clean now, we can fix this without causing more damage. But if you keep hiding the truth, it'll only get worse. Fisher's gaze shifted between Michelle and Jonathan, his mind clearly racing. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the defiance in Fisher's eyes began to fade, replaced by a weariness that seemed to weigh him down. And what happens after that? Fisher asked, his voice hoarse. What happens to me? Michelle took a deep breath. That depends on how you handle this. If you cooperate, we'll do everything we can to protect the center and the programs. But we can't protect you if you don't come clean. Fisher sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, as though the weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. I thought I was doing the right thing, he muttered, more to himself than to them. But I lost sight of what mattered. Michelle and Jonathan exchanged a glance. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment when Fisher realized there was no way out but through. They had a chance now to steer this in the right direction, but it would take careful planning and delicate handling. We'll help you make it right, Jonathan said, his voice softening. But you need to take responsibility. Fisher nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. I'll do it. The fallout from the confrontation with Fisher was immediate, though not as catastrophic as Michelle had feared. Fisher stepped down from his position quietly, citing personal reasons. The news of financial mismanagement trickled out slowly, with Michelle and Jonathan working behind the scenes to contain the damage. The community, already on edge from growing racial and economic tensions, reacted in a mix of disbelief and anger. Some defended Fisher, seeing him as a man who had done what was necessary to keep the programs running, while others were outraged that money meant for the children had been misused. Michelle watched as the community divided itself into factions, those who believed in transparency and those who believed in protecting their own. The tensions, which had always been simmering beneath the surface, now threatened to tear the town apart. But amidst the chaos, there were signs of hope. The children continued to come to choir practice, their voices rising above the noise of the outside world. Jonathan, once cold and distant, had become an ally to Michelle, working tirelessly to rebuild the trust that had been broken. As the days passed, Michelle could feel the weight of the investigation starting to lift. The hardest part was over, but there was still much work to be done. The community center was fragile, and the divisions within the town ran deep. Yet, as she watched the choir rehearse for their upcoming performance, a performance that would bring the community together, if only for a moment, Michelle knew that there was still hope. The music had the power to heal, to bridge the gaps that words couldn't. And in that, she found comfort. The day of the choir's final performance arrived faster than anyone expected. It was a chilly evening, and the community center bustled with nervous excitement as families, staff members, and townspeople trickled into the auditorium. The choir's performance was more than just a concert. It had become a symbol of hope, a chance to unite a divided community, if only for a few hours. For Michelle, the past few weeks had been some of the most intense of her career. After confronting Mr. Fisher, she had spent countless hours working with Jonathan and the center's board to quietly repair the damage. Fisher had agreed to cooperate fully, and though his reputation had taken a hit, the full scope of the financial scandal had been kept under wraps. The center's funding was now being reallocated properly, and the programs were getting back on track. But the damage to the community's trust remained. Even with Fisher stepping down and a new interim director in place, the division within the town persisted. Racial tensions, economic disparities, and the sense of betrayal over the financial mismanagement had created deep rifts, and Michelle wasn't sure if a single choir performance could heal them. Still, she hoped. The auditorium filled quickly, the low hum of conversation creating an undercurrent of nervous energy. Michelle stood backstage with the children, who were equally excited and anxious. She could see it in their faces, some of them biting their lips, others pacing or fidgeting with their choir robes. But there was also a light in their eyes, a determination that told her they were ready to sing their hearts out. Jonathan stood beside her, his arms crossed as he watched the children prepare. His presence had changed in the past few weeks. The cold distance he once held between himself and Michelle had thawed, and now there was a quiet respect between them. They had become partners in more ways than one, not just in their fight to save the community center, but in their shared belief that this choir, this performance, could be a turning point. "You ready for this?" Jonathan asked, his voice low so as not to disturb the kids. Michelle smiled, though she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "As ready as I'll ever be." Jonathan nodded, glancing out at the crowd that had gathered. "There's a lot riding on this performance." "I know," Michelle said softly, "but we've done everything we can. Now it's up to them." Jonathan gave her a small, encouraging smile before stepping away to give the children some final words of encouragement. Michelle watched him for a moment, feeling a sense of pride in how far they had come. Jonathan had been one of her toughest obstacles when she first arrived, his biases and suspicions creating a barrier between them. But now he was one of her greatest allies, someone who had confronted his own prejudices and emerged stronger because of it. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, signaling that the performance was about to begin. Michelle gathered the children in a huddle, their eager faces looking up at her. "All right, everyone," she said, her voice steady but warm. "This is your moment. You've worked so hard for this, and I know you're going to do amazing. Remember, it's not just about hitting the right notes, it's about singing from your hearts. The community needs to hear your voices tonight." The children nodded, their excitement and nerves blending into a shared sense of purpose. Michelle gave them one last encouraging smile before stepping back. It was time. As the curtains parted and the first notes of the choir rang out, Michelle felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The children's voices filled the auditorium, their harmonies weaving together in a beautiful tapestry of sound. They sang with a passion and a grace that took her breath away, their young voices carrying the weight of everything that had happened in the past weeks. The audience was silent, enraptured by the performance. Michelle scanned the faces in the crowd and saw a mixture of emotions, pride, joy, even tears. She spotted Jonathan sitting near the front with his wife Evelyn, both of them watching with awe as the children sang. She also saw Mr. Fisher sitting in the back, his face shadowed by regret and sadness, but also a quiet acceptance of what had transpired. But what struck Michelle the most were the subtle moments of unity in the audience. Families who had been on opposite sides of the town's divisions were sitting together, sharing a space and an experience that transcended the conflicts that had pulled them apart. There were no whispered arguments, no accusatory glances, just the shared experience of watching these children give their all on stage. As the performance reached its crescendo, the choir's final song was one that Michelle had chosen with care. It was a song about hope, about coming together despite differences, and about finding strength in unity. The lyrics, though simple, carried a profound message, that no matter how divided people might be, there is always the possibility of harmony, if they choose to listen to one another. The final note hung in the air for a moment, echoing through the auditorium, before the audience erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, A standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls of the community center. The children on stage beamed with pride, their faces glowing with the joy of knowing they had done something extraordinary. Michelle stood backstage, her heart swelling with pride and emotion. She had come here to investigate a financial scandal, but what she had found was something much deeper. She had found a community struggling to find its way, a group of children desperate for a chance to be heard, and people like Jonathan, who had the capacity to change and grow when confronted with their own biases. As the applause continued, Jonathan appeared at her side, his eyes misty with emotion. "That was incredible," he said quietly. Michelle nodded, unable to find the words to express what she was feeling. The choir's performance had been more than just music. It had been a moment of healing, a glimpse of what the community could be if it chose to move beyond its divisions. As the audience began to leave the auditorium, Michelle and Jonathan stayed behind to help the children pack up. The air was filled with excited chatter, the kids' voices bubbling over with pride and joy. Jonathan helped a few of the younger ones with their robes, his demeanor soft and warm, so different from the man Michelle had first met. "I think we did something good here," Jonathan said as he handed a robe to one of the kids. Michelle smiled, her heart full. "We did." Later that night, after the center had emptied and the children had gone home, Michelle stood outside the building, looking up at the stars. The night was quiet now, the only sound the distant hum of cars passing by. Jonathan joined her a few moments later, standing beside her in comfortable silence. "You leaving soon?" Jonathan asked after a long pause. "Yeah," Michelle replied, her voice soft. "The investigation's wrapped up. They'll bring in someone new to run the center, and things should get back to normal." Jonathan nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "You did a lot more than just run a choir, you know? You helped bring this place back together." Michelle glanced over at him, feeling a mix of emotions. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jonathan smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "We make a good team." As they stood there, side by side, Michelle felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The center still had a long way to go, and the town would have to continue working through its divisions, but the seeds of change had been planted. The choir's performance had shown them all what was possible when people came together, when they chose to listen rather than judge. Michelle knew she would carry this experience with her for the rest of her life. It had been more than just an assignment. It had been a lesson in empathy, in understanding, and in the power of music to heal even the deepest wounds. As she prepared to leave the town and return to her life as an FBI agent, she knew that the echoes of harmony would continue long after she was gone. The community center, the choir, and the people who had come together would keep moving forward, guided by the music they had created together. And that, Michelle realized, was the greatest victory of all. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.